Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And then he said to them, "Take care. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly. And he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." And then he said, "I will do this. I will pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many, many years. So relax. Eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be now?' So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich inside." He said to his disciples, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, or about your body, what you will wear. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. And can any of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your span of life? If then you are not able to do small a thing as that, why do you worry about the rest? And do not keep striving for what you are to eat and what you are to drink, and do not keep worrying. For it is the nations of the world that strive after all these things. Strive instead for the kingdom of God, and these things will be given to you as well." So I tossed this morning's sermon about 8:45. So let's see how it goes, okay? My only goal is to give you food for thought, not necessarily to be a decent orator this morning, all right? So this sermon, this new one, has two parts. Somehow we need to hold them in tension as well. Do not be anxious. That was at the heart of last week's passage. It is again at the heart of this week's passage. Do not be anxious. So on a scale of 1 to 10, what kind of score do all of you get around that? Okay. It's all right. Nobody's taking marks, you know. Nobody's marking you. So we're going to deal with, I think, the big anxiety over here, and then we're going to do some of the little anxiety, which becomes big anxiety over here. Last week around my Thanksgiving table, we ended up in a conversation that happens a lot at my table, actually. And that is, as we are looking at some of the larger trends across the planet, climate change, the tensions between bullies who happen to be leaders of certain countries, and more, mass movement of refugees, global economics that ensures that the rich keep getting more and more food on their plate, the poor less. I don't need to go into all of that. And the big question at the end, of course, is, you know what the big question is? what do we do? Is there hope? It's very interesting, the two sides of the conversation. So you have these people over here who says, we are so toast. We are toast. The latest numbers say that life on this planet, as we know it, has on the outside another 100 years. And my son informed me the other day that somebody who's watching numbers at Wall Street and other numbers as well says there will start being some significant wars on the planet over food. Some people think that might happen earlier, and then let's not even talk about over water. So the people around this table were, throwing out all of these realities. And you had some people say, you know what, there's not a thing we can do. We got to just do what we can to kind of make changes in our own life and care for the people in our circle, and nothing to do. Hopeless. Hopeless. Actually, both sides of that conversation were hopeless in terms of the larger things, right? That at the end of the day, climate change is that train that's way out of the station. And the way it's already affecting people, particularly people in the developing world, particularly people who are already giving way to their homes because the oceans are encroaching. Their lives are changed forever, and those aren't the kinds of things that we're reading about daily. So Richard Rohr, who is a Catholic theologian who has a daily blog, very often has things that I like to share with you, and I know a number of you are getting his blogs. And so he asked a friend of his to choose a mystic, choose somebody within the Christian tradition who has a deep understanding of how widely connected we all are to one another. And so it's not just somebody who will say, just go to your knees and pray and stay there in a safe place. Not very helpful. This woman who he asked to share the blog with him chose a 20th century mystic whose name is Teilhard de Chardin, and some of you may be familiar with him. Teilhard de Chardin, who lived through the Holocaust and the Second World War. So this is a man who is acquainted with large human global events that have been responsible for incredible suffering. And these are her reflections on him. And I think he has something to teach us. And I think it is the lesson for this tradition of this century. Anyway, let's see what he has to say. She writes, in the midst of our own social, political concerns, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who was a French philosopher and a paleontologist and a Jesuit priest, enters the equation offering a vastly broader and more hopeful perspective in which to search for a new moral grounding. Writing in a historical era whose traumatic upheavals eerily foreshadow our own, he is yet able to paint a bigger picture where there is still room for optimism and coherence. He was actually accused of false optimism, of an indifference to personal suffering after World War II, when people and nations still shaken from the horrors of the Holocaust and Hiroshima struggled with personal and collective remorse. But he was no means indifferent. His life-transforming vision of oneness of humanity came to him in the midst of serving as a stretcher bearer in the bloody trenches of World War I. And his writings on human progress rose from the personal suffering he experienced by facing and naming that horror in his midst. The following prayer of his makes clear that there is no cheap optimism that he is dispensing here, but a wrenchingly honest acknowledgement of our human predicament and an unfailing faithfulness to see the mystery that we call God in every aspect of the earth, even in human suffering. I wonder what he'd say right now about the planet's suffering. But here is his prayer. You know it yourself, Lord. through having borne the anguish of it as a man. On certain days, the world seems a terrifying thing. Huge, blind, and brutal. At any moment, the vast and horrible thing may break in through the cracks. The thing which we try hard to forget is always there, separated from us by a flimsy partition. Pestilence, hurricanes, earthquakes, or the unleashing of dark moral forces. These callously sweep away in one moment what we had laboriously built up and beautified with all our intelligence and all our love. Since my human dignity, O God, forbids me to close my eyes to this, teach me to adore it by seeing you concealed within it. Teach me to adore it, all of it, by seeing you concealed in it. So that's part one. How do we learn to live with some of those frightening, tragic, nothing we can do about movements without falling into total denial? Let's just go and shop at Walmart, have another drink, or turn on our favorite television show. So part two has to do with thinking about what Jesus was saying. I mean, he was challenging people who thought that their wealth would save them, right? It's interesting as I move through my week and move through the life of people within our circle and beyond. Those questions about what will we eat or what will we drink, not many of us are losing sleep about that, though we probably did for a long time or thought we needed to. When you think about the house we bought and we think about the mortgage and you think about the jobs that we tried to establish for ourselves, paychecks, pensions, etc. Yes, we've all lost a lot of sleep about that. All those things. But I think most of us are actually at the time of our lives where all those things are fairly secure, and now we're looking at the work required in the second half of life, when in fact we're beginning to suffer losses in our personal lives at an unprecedented rate. So I think about someone like Anne Raby, who at the age of 96, and she's a fighter, is now mortified that she will probably not return to her own home after this significant fall. And I think about those people among our circle of friends who were among us in body 8-9 months ago, and now it's a struggle to leave their homes. And then I think about those of us who are living with partners who have dementia and the kinds of loss that that represents in their lives every single day. And so I think that the challenge for our culture, especially white Anglo-Saxon middle-class Protestants, it's not that we're worried so much anymore about what will we eat or what will we drink. Those aren't actually the things that we're afraid of losing. That was the question of the peasant in Palestine when Jesus was talking, when everybody was living on about 700 calories a day. Those were real questions. The real question, I think, for us in terms of our own, what are we worried about, not fear and anxiety, once we move the larger things that are happening on the planet over to the side, has to do with the things to which we have attached our lives: relationships, health, community, that suddenly start to dissolve, and it's all unique. And so I think that between the place where Jesus says, look, you can be anxious, but if you're anxious about this, you're not going to gain another day in your life. You're just actually going to lose this one. To moving to that place of letting go, I think is a wall. And I think it's a wall that is pretty specific to, I'm just going to say, the middle class on this continent. And that wall is called grief. So that we're here and we're anxious and we're angry and we've suffered incredible losses, whether they be in health or partnership or mobility or community or you have your own litany. And the invitation is to let go and get to that other place. But I think there is a journey to that other place. And it is a journey through grief. And most of the sociologists of our day would say we live in a grief-denying, death-denying culture. And if you want to have evidence for that, check out how many people actually even want funerals anymore. Nobody wants a funeral. The funeral directors are freaking, by the way. Oh, I mean, if you're over 70, more or less, most of you guys will probably have funerals because you've grown up with that tradition. And it's interesting in talking to Ava Darling, who is one of the people kind of co-chairing the Death Cafe conversation in Wellington, I said, so the conversation is just to talk about death, right? I think there's something about our tradition, actually, that we've talked about death a little bit more than the world or our culture in general. But I'm not sure we've always provided the space or the invitation for the real work of grieving. The grieving that needs to take place when things that we love are suddenly disappearing daily. And I'm going to read to you a little excerpt, starting with a quote from Oscar Wilde: "Where there is sorrow, there is holy ground." Over the course of our lives, grief enters our hearts in many ways. If we are to acknowledge and tend our grief, it is important to become familiar with what I call the 5 gates of grief. Each of these doorways leads to the communal hall of grief, and each helps us understand the many ways that loss touches our hearts and souls in this life. The first gate of grief is this: everything we love, we will lose. I have come to have a deep faith in grief, have come to see the way its moods call us back to soul. It is, in fact, one of the voices of the soul asking us to face life's most difficult but essential teachings. Everything is a gift, and nothing lasts. This is a painful truth. To accept this fact is to live on life's terms and not to try to deny the simple truth of loss, what the Buddhists call impermanence. When we acknowledge grief, we acknowledge that everything we love, we will lose. No exceptions. Now, of course, we want to argue this point, saying that we will keep in our hearts the love of those who depart this earth before us, our parents, or our spouse, or our children, or our friends, and yes, that is true. It is grief, however, that allows the heart to stay open to this love, to remember sweetly the ways these people touched our lives. It is only when we deny grief's entry into our lives that we begin to compress the breadth of our emotional experience and live shallowly. There is a poem from the 12th century that beautifully articulates this lasting truth about the risks we take when we choose to love. "'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch. 'Tis a fearful thing to love what death can touch." So I offer you these things to think about, because as I've moved through this week and run into different ones among you, I hear you wrestling with an invitation again to let something go. And it's so hard. And there is an anxiety and an anger that we all get stuck in. Because for some reason, on this continent, we've been led to believe, at some level, we say we haven't, but that life is a bed of roses. And you know, on this continent, it is. It is a bed of roses. But that has meant that we haven't always got the tools, the emotional tools, the spiritual tools, to let it all go.